Hello and welcome to Special Dialogue on TVRI World with me, Siska Becker. On today's program, we are highlighting one of the world's most heated disputes in the geopolitical stage right now, the South China Sea conflict. It is a complex and prolonged conflict that's been a subject of discussion and debate among different stakeholders worldwide. The dispute involves territorial claims and maritime rights over a significant portion of the South China Sea, a vital trade route and rich fishing area that is believed to contain substantial oil and gas deposits. Now, to get a better understanding of this ongoing conflict and to discuss possible solutions to the dispute, we are very fortunate to have here in the studio as our guest, Mr. Robert Harris, Assistant Legal Advisor for East Asia and Pacific Affairs from the United States Department of State. Hello, Bob. Would it be okay to call you Bob?
Absolutely. Please do.
Thank you so much for being here. We are very excited to have you here to talk a lot about this ongoing conflict of the South China Sea. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to dive right into the conversation by starting with the historical aspect of it. Now, as we know, China claims it has millennia worth of history with the region, claiming that it owned the region ever since the Qing dynasty. And then this claim was cemented around 70 years ago with the now infamous 9-dash line. And the dispute has been ongoing with now at least 5 claimant states with overlapping claims of maritime borders. Now, if you'd be so kind to enlighten us, especially our viewers, from your perspective, from your extensive knowledge, what do you think actually is the bulk of the problem? When did it start, and how does it stem from a regional dispute into this now worldwide conflict?
Well, thank you very much. I'll approach it sort of both from an international legal perspective and, at least for this first set of questions, from a historical perspective as well. If one looks at the South China Sea, what one sees is the periphery of the South China Sea with countries, Vietnam, Indonesia at the very southern tip, Malaysia on both sides, Brunei, and the Philippines, and at the very northern part, you have Hainan Island from China and Taiwan. And so the South China Sea disputes are not over those large land areas, but over very tiny islands that are in the South China Sea. And there are territorial disputes, and then there are maritime disputes, and they're very different. The underlying tension stems from the territorial disputes. So there are a number of island groups in the South China Sea. Near Vietnam, in the north, you have the Paracel Islands. Okay. Those are claimed by Vietnam on the one hand, and by China and Taiwan on the other. If you move over closer to the Philippines, you have a very, very small island, roughly the size of this chair, okay, called Scarborough Reef. And right. Scarborough Reef is claimed by the Philippines on the one hand, and by China and Taiwan on the other. But then when most people think about the South China Sea and think about the disputes, they think about the Spratly Islands. Yeah. And that's a very large group of very small islands that are in the central and southern part of the South China Sea. And those are claimed in their whole by Vietnam on the one hand, and by China and Taiwan on the other. They claim sovereignty over all of those little islands. Okay. The Philippines claim sovereignty over most of those islands. Even Brunei claims sovereignty over one of the islands, and Malaysia claims sovereignty over a large number of the islands as well. So those are the territorial disputes. And those are very complicated to decide who is right and who is wrong as a matter of international law. And the United States, like all countries in the world, don't take positions on those disputes. Indonesia does not have a territorial dispute in the South China Sea. But there are also maritime claims and maritime disputes in the South China Sea. And those are more complicated. Those are subject to international law, which is much more understandable than the territorial claims. The territorial claims are based on history. Yes. The maritime claims are based on the international law of the sea, which is grounded in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Okay. And there are very clear rules for what are lawful maritime claims and what are not lawful maritime claims. And so when I talk about the disputes in the South China Sea, I tend to not talk about the territorial disputes and talk more about the law of the sea and what are the rights and entitlements, not only of who might claim the little tiny islands, but over their land base. So for example, Indonesia has Natuna Island.
Yeah.
And Natuna Island generates a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, which are sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the resources in the water and in the seabed and subsoil. Think oil and gas when you think about that.
Okay. Now, for most Indonesians who are observing this conflict, it's more like watching some neighbors dispute, because we think we don't have a direct claim and there's no direct consequences of the conflict to us Indonesians. Now, maybe you could shed some light on it. Why should we have more discussions on this, and why should Indonesia, especially now with our position as chair of ASEAN, should know more about this conflict and how it affects us?
Well, I would go back to the distinction between territorial disputes and the law of the sea.
Okay.
So as a matter of the territorial disputes, Indonesia does not have a direct stake. Obviously, you have concerns for your ASEAN neighbors.
Yes.
And you also have concerns, as do all countries, that disputes are resolved peacefully and in accordance with international law.
True.
On the maritime disputes, Indonesia has a direct interest.
Okay.
Indonesia's sovereign rights and jurisdiction to the resources of the fish and the oil and gas are directly implicated in the South China Sea, in part because the Chinese have a really expansive maritime claim, enormous maritime claim that overlaps with the Indonesian exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, the same way it overlaps with the lawful entitlements of Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Brunei. Okay. So in the sense of the legal law of the sea dispute, you have the same set of problems that your ASEAN neighbors have.
Okay. Now, Bob, you've been mentioning since the beginning how the law actually dictates, the maritime borders of each country involved in this conflict, a conflict that is no short of actors.
Right.
It's very busy, right? You mentioned about the UN law established in 1982 with the exclusive economic zones, which clearly state 200 nautical miles of each of the country's shore is the territory of that country. But of course, we've seen in many instances that China doesn't abide to this ruling. And even in 2016, The Hague actually made it quite clear that they think China's claim has no legal basis when they decided that the Philippines actually has more legal claim to the territory. But even with all these, legal proceedings, legal precedents, it seems that China has not moved an inch from its standing. How do you see this?
Well, it is a big problem. The Philippines in 2013 believed that their rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea were being jeopardized by the actions and claims of China. And it used what tool it had in its toolkit was to bring a lawsuit under the convention and have an independent group of jurists rule on whether the Philippines or China was right as to what their respective rights under the law of the sea were. And they won a resounding victory. The tribunal unanimously found that China could not claim historic rights in the South China Sea, nor could they claim rights to entire island groups in the South China Sea designated by the PRC. Unfortunately, in the immediate aftermath of that, the PRC clarified their maritime claims to claim exactly those two rights. Those rights, as a matter of international law, are just clearly inconsistent with the law of the sea. I mean, if you talk to professors of international, and I am one, of international law of the sea, it is an easy question that those maritime claims lack any basis in international law. But the problem is they're hugely expansive. and they interfere with the Philippines' rights to fish in their waters, to exploit oil and gas. The same with Malaysia, the same with Brunei, the same with Vietnam, and the same with Indonesia. And all countries are experiencing interference with their activities to do oil and gas exploration, to have their fishermen do the fishing that they're allowed to do under international law. So it's a very, very serious problem, and it's not just a problem, it's not even principally a problem for the United States or other countries. It's principally a problem for the countries in the region, but it's important to remember that there are rights that all countries enjoy in the law of the sea, the freedom of navigation to do the sorts of things that commerce has had us do for hundreds of years. So the entire world has a stake in the compliance with international law. And the international law of the sea is a tremendously important body of international law. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface. So it's impossible to think of a peaceful, secure world where not all countries are following the same sets of rules.
Okay, now before we move on to the next segment, let me ask you about the complexity of this issue, where one of the problems is all these overlapping claims from each country. Do you think there is a possibility of resolving the dispute with all these overlapping claims and all the contentious issues within each country?
Well, I think the answer should be yes. The answer to some extent is yes. I mean, if you think back to late last year, Indonesia and Vietnam completed a very, very important maritime boundary agreement of the exclusive economic zone where they resolved peacefully and in accordance with the law of the sea their overlapping entitlements to EEZ. I think you'll see other agreements that are being concluded as well. So there can be success in this area. It would be helpful if all countries were prepared to allow international law to be the basis for the peaceful resolution of the disputes.
All right, Bob, we've learned so much already from the first segment. In the next segment, I will talk to you about the U.S. government's policy and position on the South China Sea, but right coming after these messages.
Thanks.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back on Special Dialogue. Welcome back to Special Dialogue with me, Siska Becker, and my guest, Mr. Robert Harris, Assistant Legal Advisor for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, United States Department of State. Bob, like I said before, in this next segment, I would love to talk more about the U.S. government's policy and position on the South China Sea dispute. So could you tell us what is actually the U.S. government's policy on the South China Sea dispute as of now in 2023?
Thank you. Our position has actually been very consistent over the last decade. Okay. The United States, like all other countries, doesn't take a position on those territorial disputes that I'd mentioned before. We do hope and expect that they'd be resolved peacefully and in accordance with international law. With respect to the maritime disputes, we have a global policy of trying to support compliance with the international law of the sea, as reflected in the UNCLOS, the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. Yeah. And so with respect to that, we do take positions on whether countries are complying with the international law of the sea. So in that continues to be an important interest of ours. As a country that uses the South China Sea, like all the other countries that use the South China Sea, $3 trillion of trade goes through every year. And the entire world has a very important stake in freedom of navigation and lawful commerce being respected in those areas.
Okay, as you said, it has been a hot issue for the last decade, but maybe it's safe to say in the past 2 years, it heated up quite a bit. Was that the reason why the U.S. State Department released China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, which you were heavily involved in. Actually, you were one of the briefers when the findings were released to the foreign press. Could you tell us more about this?
The State Department, as I noted, has a big interest in compliance with the international law of the sea. So in the early 1970s, the State Department began a technical and legal study, a series of reports. Limits in the Seas 150 was the 150th of these reports. It evaluates the claims of all countries around the world for their compliance with international law. In 2016, after the arbitral award, China re-articulated its maritime claims in the South China Sea to claim historic rights and also claim rights of entire island groups treated as a whole. Those were two novel arguments that the PRC effectively raised for the first time formally in 2016. And so we had never done an analysis at the Department of State of those claims like we do of other countries around the world. So we decided that it was worth spending some time and energy to evaluate whether those maritime claims in the South China Sea were consistent with international law.
And did you find anything new in the findings that you released in 2022?
We found a number of troubling aspects to China's maritime claims in the South China Sea. The idea that there were historic rights is something that's inconsistent with UNCLOS. The Law of the Sea Convention provides that maritime entitlements, territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, derive from sovereignty over land, and that there isn't a body of general historic rights that countries can enjoy, that would somehow be inconsistent with the very detailed rules set out in the Law of the Sea Convention. Going to the historic claims of China, if you look at those much more clearly are relevant with respect to the territorial disputes. So they would be arguing that Chinese explorers found these very tiny islands in the 1700s. Of course, other countries would be saying, no, our explorers discovered them, and you'd have a big factual question. But historic claims are much more relevant in the territorial disputes than they are in the Law of the Sea questions. And the Law of the Sea Convention, in one place, tried to resolve what all the lawful maritime entitlements to states would be. But to answer your question, we found that there was no legal basis for the very expansive claims that China was making, either to historic rights or to treat very, very far-flung tiny groups of islands as an entity and draw baselines around them and claim maritime entitlements from them, that neither of those were consistent with international law.
The 9-dash line, you mean, that
well,
is included?
That's one of the interesting questions. There's still some ambiguity about what China's maritime claims are. A lot of times people, when they think about the 9-dash line, think that that's a description of historic rights. And it might be. They've not been 100% clear. But there's the second claim as well, that you can treat entire island groups, very far-flung, geographically disparate, tiny groups of islands as a single unit, and treat them all as an area that you could draw baselines around, claiming internal waters within and maritime zones from. And one of the things in the study that we looked at, because China has argued that there's some customary international law that could justify this, even if it was inconsistent with UNCLOS, that there was a basis for doing that. The Limits in the Seas report had what we call a state practice supplement. That's about 100 pages long, that looked at all the state practice that was relevant in this area to see if China had met the requirements of there being a new rule of customary international law. And is it okay if I spend 30 seconds as a lawyer?
Of course. Go ahead.
To be customary international law, you have to have two requirements. There has to be a general and consistent practice of states. States all over the world must do the same thing. And they must do so out of a sense that they're legally obligated to do that. So Limits in the Seas 150 looked at the state practice of all the states that, like China, were non-archipelagic states, that were continental states that had distant island groups, to see if that practice was consistent with there being a separate body of international law. And the overwhelming conclusion was that states with those kinds of island groups are trying to comply with the Law of the Sea Convention. They don't believe that there's a customary international law that's different. And what they're trying to do is draw baselines, whether it's a normal baseline or whether it's a straight baseline or any of those rules. They're trying to comply with international law. So there's no legal basis for a claim that customary international law could support the island group theory.
Okay, so in this study, China's claim is discussed very heavily, but what about the overlapping claims from the other claimant states? What is U.S. positions on this?
Well, our position is the same as with China, that all maritime claims in the South China Sea need to be consistent with international law as reflected in the Law of the Sea Convention. And so that's our position for all countries. It just so happens that one country in particular is more of an outlier on compliance with that than others.
Okay. Now, we might be steering off a bit out of your expertise because this is what lots of people are saying about the U.S.-China relations regarding the South China Sea conflict. It's more of a great standing in the region that China is trying to, exert its dominance over the region, and that the U.S. is trying its hardest not to make China to be overpowering, especially in that area. What are your opinions on this?
I would say the question is more compliance with international law, that after two terrible wars in the 20th century, the international community came together and drafted a UN charter and drafted many other treaties that would try to have everyone in the world play by the same set of rules. And the Law of the Sea Convention is one of those really fundamental charters where everyone in the world now has a set of rules that they're supposed to comply with. To the extent that a country, especially a powerful country, decides not to comply with those rules, it really jeopardizes the entire system that all countries need to rely on, especially countries that don't have powerful militaries. It's one of those situations where the rule of law actually protects the less powerful countries in particular. And so I think for there to be peace and stability, since 1945, the world has grown dramatically, not fast enough in terms of economies, but it has grown tremendously. And it's been the compliance with that rules-based system that has really been an engine and a facilitator of that peaceful growth and prosperity, growing prosperity.
Yeah. So as one of the, if not the strongest economy of the world, of course, the U.S. has a really big stake in keeping the region's stability because it is one of the busiest trading route in the world with $3 trillion worth of economy going through, each year. But not just that, because people are seeing now U.S.'s presence as more vocal, more aggressive maybe for some people, because we see how the U.S. is now becoming more vocal on its support to the Philippines, for instance, opening up another military base. And then the cooperation between U.S., UK, and Australia in the region is also seen as one of the political chess moves, as a statement to the Chinese, as in, you got to be careful on, making your next move concerning this dispute. I just want to know, what's your take on that?
I would say that the entire world has recognized the importance of what people call the Indo-Pacific. It's the largest growing area of the world. It has more than half the world's population, more than half of the world's gross domestic product. It's just a very important area. And it's not surprising that everyone in the world is paying attention to it. I would say one of the important things in all of our relations in this part of the world is respect for ASEAN centrality. And that for us is really an important linchpin. So all of the work that we do with other countries in the Indo-Pacific is sort of premised on ASEAN being sort of the center point for that diplomacy. With respect to AUKUS, I mean, it's not surprising that the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia work together on issues. I mean, we've done that for centuries. And so this is simply an application of long-standing alliances. The U.S.-Philippines alliance has been in place for more than 70 years, and it's a fundamental aspect of both of our countries, not just security architecture, but our people's lives. We have such close relations, the people of the Philippines and the people of the United States. And those are the kind of alliances we're hoping to build. And it's not just military alliances, it's these sorts of economic, friendly relations that we have. So this is not a zero-sum game, and we certainly don't see it as such.
Okay. Now, one of the latest developments in this dispute, China has been aggressively building up infrastructure on man-made islands in the South China Sea, including military facilities. This is based on aerial surveillance on the islands. Do you know what the U.S. government's position on this?
Well, it's an unfortunate development. I think if one were to go back to the year 2002, ASEAN and China negotiated a declaration of conduct. And in that declaration of conduct, China and the ASEAN states agreed not to take actions that would escalate the disputes or complicate the disputes. And the idea, if you have a disputed feature and you decide that you're going to build a gigantic military base on it, is an action that seems to complicate or escalate the disputes. So I think from the ASEAN perspective, that's much more the challenge, is that made solving these disputes among the claimants that much more difficult.
Okay, so you see ASEAN as one of the key elements to resolving this issue?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because you've mentioned this quite a few times actually in many open forums, and now that Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN, how do you think Indonesia can play a key role in actually resolving this decades-long of conflict?
It's very challenging. I would say that, and it's challenging, both the territorial disputes are very difficult to resolve. Those are traditionally the hardest of all disputes to resolve because so many elements of national sovereignty and national pride enter into the resolution of territorial disputes. Maritime disputes shouldn't be as hard to resolve because you have the Law of the Sea Convention that tells you what the entitlements are. But it is still hard, obviously, and it's very challenging to try to resolve that. But I think who better than Indonesia to be in a position to try to help resolve these disputes? You're the largest country in ASEAN. You're the most influential country in ASEAN, and it's your turn. And so that's who better than Indonesia.
Thank you for those encouraging words, Bob. Now, last question before we end this program. Maybe you can tell us, what can Indonesia expect actually from the U.S., in relation to this dispute, and how can Indonesia with U.S. become partners actually to resolve this issue?
Well, when you think about the unlawful maritime claims of China, at this point, there are a lot of countries that have formally submitted diplomatic notes rejecting those claims. That includes in this region Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia. It also includes Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. So you have friends who are very concerned about compliance with international law and the fact that Indonesia should be able to exercise the rights that it enjoys as a matter of international law. And I think that is a group of friends who are interested in compliance with international law. And I think that that's a good starting point. It's certainly not a solution, but it certainly should make Indonesia and all the South China Sea claimants feel that they're not alone.
All right. Bob, thank you so much for enlightening us with your extensive knowledge. And it'll be interesting to see how our foreign minister will approach this issue in the upcoming ASEAN summit. Hopefully we can see each other again to discuss this further.
And we wish him the best of luck.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Bob, for being here. And thank you to our viewers for giving us the time to learn more about this heated dispute that we hope can be resolved quickly. So I'll see you again in the next episode of Special Dialogue with me, Siska Becker. Until then, take care.